Off the Wall Productions is proud to present Voices of the Methow. This is a series of conversations with interesting folk in and around the valley. This is a talk given by Diana Hottell and Sheila Mclean at the Confluence Art Gallery on November 24th, 2018. There was a large receptive crowd there to enjoy their words. Diana kicked things off first, and she and Sheila traded portions throughout their talk. Thank you, Diana and Sheila, for a job well done. Well, sit back and let Diana and Sheila take you on a verbal journey.
This better be good. Anyway, thank you all for coming. Today, Sheila and I are going to paint you word pictures to evoke the Methow Valley's multi-storied past. We've both delved into personal diaries and are going to share them with you. Sheila, fourth generation in the Methow, has gleaned nuggets from her family's writings about their early coming into the country, and will conclude with two poem songs written by her father, Ron Mclean, that encapsulate what the Methow Valley meant to him and will continue to resonate for as long as people make the Methow Valley their home. I'm going to begin, since this is a show on cabin couture, I'm going to read to you about building a log cabin up the Twisp River in the early 70s, and then bring you into the company of several early settlers whom I interviewed for the Methow Valley News back in the 70s and 80s. Forgive me periodically any politically incorrect language, but that's the way we talked back then. No disrespect intended. I'm going to start with a quote from Henry Beston, who wrote The Outermost House in 1926. The world today is sick to its thin blood for lack of elemental things, for fire before the hands, for water welling from the earth, for air, for the dear earth itself underfoot. Nature is a part of our humanity, and without some awareness and experience of that divine mystery, man ceases to be man. When the Pleiades and the wind and the grass are no longer a part of the human spirit, a part of very flesh and bone, man becomes, as it were, a kind of cosmic outlaw, having neither the completedness of the animal nor the birthright of a true humanity. I will start from my diaries. The lower logs of the cabin were cut in 1948 by John Klinkert to build the bridge that spanned the river to our house, after the old bridge was washed away by the flood that year. We bought the place in 1972 after a newer log bridge replaced the one Klinkert had built. The rest of the logs were felled by Bob Billenby from the Boulder Creek burn northeast of Winthrop. When the chainsaw died, some of the lodgepole pines were felled by axe. We hauled them back to the Lightning RR in our red Chevy pickup. We dragged the logs down to the site beside the Twisp River with our 51 Ford tractor. We erected pulleys, attached cables in the cottonwood tree, and by a complex system, we hauled the logs into place. We hand peeled and hand adzed the logs, laid fiberglass insulation in between. Each log was notched by chainsaw, then affixed with huge spikes left over from the bridge. These spikes are 18 inches long and were handmade in the old blacksmith shop in Twisp. After 10 weeks working on it, the cabin was about waist high. The next summer, we finished the place in 4 weeks of dawn to dusk days, minus the roof shakes, which we'd put on the next summer. Bill bought secondhand furniture and salvaged windows and a stove for $35 from Boston Junk, all in Spokane. The rough lumber planks for loft and ceiling were from the Second Mile sawmill. The door was pried off Duncan's old root cellar. We spilled the sawdust out of it and filled it with fiberglass. John Rudolph found the door handle, a mountain ash grown in on itself. By chance, the cabin is almost directly on the north-south axis, and noon can be told when the sun hits the edge of the stove. It is a place of high-energy peace. I have seldom seen Bill pull up a chair to a window and just sit in absolute tranquility without a book in his hand. The cabin has given him this, and to me. We find ourselves just standing and staring at the logs or angles or the river, which seem to flow from ourselves. It is so close. At night, in the light of kerosene lamps, with the wood stove warming the place, with the river singing in our ears, we experience exquisite joy. And this is notes from a guest book we'd left lying around in the log cabin for years and years and years. This is a quote someone put. "To one who has been long in city pent, 'tis very sweet to look into the fair and open face of heaven." Thank you for building this little house. I feel very rich here. I sit in a position of royal ease. I can look to my left and be half blinded by liquid silver from moving water. Solid stones and earth soothe my glance as it moves right to the peaks, which are white and clear. I want to ride a cow back to Seattle. Love, Maggie. Other excerpts. It's so sad to leave. It's as close as I'll ever get to heaven. 2 days alone, only the sound of the water, the leaves blowing, falling, the coyotes, the cat. I cut some wood, swept cobwebs, ate Kelowna apples, and so I return a little more patient, with a little more hope, enabled to love more for a while. La lucha continua. It's been too long since I've lived on a river. I'd forgotten its song. It's a true gift to find a human-made abode that does not stand as an affront to Mother Nature. I am filled with awe and reverence for the earth and am grateful in my bones to have had this chance to remember my place as part of nature. And one of my own entries from January 9th, 1994. The stars in the cloudless sky were so scintillating you could hear them singing. Bill thrilled to have his naked eyes catch Andromeda Galaxy, 2 million light years away. We slept long and deep. After breakfast, the sun poured into the cabin. Outside, diamonds were strewn everywhere. And this is an excerpt from my October 1977 diary. Through unlocked gates, we drove up to the site of Byron, a boom mining town in the 1890s. High school kids from Tacoma and Liberty Bell explored the mill and mine drifts and old cabins and hillsides. Margaret, who was one of the chaperones, she was a writer, she and I made our way to a ruin of a log cabin. Inside, we saw the roof caved in, everything fallen to ruin, but wallpaper still hung on parts of the walls. Margaret immediately created a story. She saw the wife of a miner in the cabin trying to make her solitary, hard life a little brighter. She'd ordered Sears catalogs, which had pages that were actual samples of wallpaper, everyone different. She felt a little guilty, but she had no choice. She tore out the sample pages and pasted them on the wall. Brittle pieces of a Wenatchee World from 1931 was somehow still glued on. Margaret remembered the Depression years and empathized with the woman of her imagination who lived there. She explained the art of making clothes from flour and sugar sacks. Sometimes the sacking had flowers printed on it, since the manufacturers were well aware what was going on in the houses across hungry and moneyless America. Free flour during the Depression came in sacks. that had a particularly strong dye in the printing, indicating it was free. She remembered her parents were too proud to go and get any, even though they needed it. That bold printing was impossible to eradicate. There was no hiding from the shame when those dresses were worn. Sheila. Right. We're going to go back and forth.
Yep. I hope what I have brought to you here will shed light on the lifestyles in which cabin couture developed in our valley. The ramshackle, changeable lives of hard work and big dreams help explain why some material possessions were so important. First, for life and death survival, and then also as symbols of dreams and beauty. I have cobbled together this reading from individual diaries and memoirs of my paternal family, the Mcleans. All the writers are gone now, but I am grateful to be able to bring their words to you. I'll skip around quite a bit in their writings, so I have made a chart that you may want to reference. This is not all of them either, but I'll start with a narrative from my father's brother, Rick, telling about their father, Chan. And if you in the back can't hear me, wave your arms, please. This is Rick speaking. Chan Mclean was born into the feverish mining activity of the Methow Valley and North Cascades within a year after his parents, Dick and Sarah Mclean, arrived there in 1894 to play a heavy role in settling the valley and opening the mines. There is an anecdote that on one of the horseback trips into the mines, Dick removed a sack from one of the saddles. A bystander thought it moved slightly and a faint, suspicious sound issued from it. He asked, "Dick, what have you in that sack?" Dick's reply, "Oh, that's Chan." There is not much on record about Chan's early life. He had but an 8th grade education and was always a laborer. Now we jump to Ruth. Ruth was Chan's younger sister, and she tells this. Soon after moving from Idaho, a 4th child, Chan, was born to Dick and Sarah in 1895. No doctor, so Mrs. Charles Bosel came from several miles away to attend the birth. In the spring of 1897, our father, Dick Mclean, moved us to a place about 3.5 miles north of Winthrop, on the west bank of the Chewok. That year, he filed homestead rights on it. It had 2 cabins. One was a trapper's cabin with no floor, and the other a squatter's hut. We occupied the floored one. Ruth recalls that school was held for a few months in the one without a floor. That homestead, of course, is the place now occupied by Dick Mclean's grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and great-great-grandchildren. And I now add great-great-great-grandchildren. But Dick and Sarah Mclean didn't live there very long. In 1899, after spring term, our father, Dick Mclean, moved us up to the layout cabin, just this side of Hart's Pass. It made him a good place to stop over on his trips into the mines. We kids ran wild along the creek bank and in the woods close by. We could hear the bells on the horses before we could see them, and we would rush to tell Mother so she could get the kettle going on the crude fireplace. But all this came to an abrupt end near the last of September that year. Dad had brought in only mail on his latest trip, so had but 2 horses with him. He had eaten lunch with us at the layout cabin, but traveled on to Slate Creek for the night. He awoke the next morning at Slate Creek to find that it had snowed all night and was snowing still. Slate Creek was many miles from the layout cabin in extremely remote terrain. Dad lost no time in getting back to the layout cabin, bringing Bill Paul, a valley neighbor who also happened to be in Slate Creek. I was not yet 6 years old, Ruth recalls, but I remember Mother was very frightened. Slides could be deadly, and deep snow could cut off supply sources. In fact, the layout cabin some years later was completely demolished by a snowslide, killing 2 men. The bodies were removed the following spring. Anyway, Dad and Bill Paul finally arrived back at the layout cabin. They brought 2 horses and some snowshoes. There were 5 children, Mother, the 2 men, and some necessary bedding and clothing to be taken out. My mother and the baby, Alice, were put in one saddle and bedding packed behind. My 2 elder brothers rode on another horse with bedding lashed behind the saddle. Dad took Chan, and Bill Paul carried me piggyback. Not wearing snowshoes, they carried us the 10 miles or so to Robinson Creek at much lower altitude. There they got a rig, put us kids to bed under the blankets and hay, and we knew nothing more till we arrived home the next morning. Now Rick writes, many Indians came over from the reservation around Okanagan, especially in the fall when the berries were ripe and the salmon were arriving to spawn. The white and Indian children played a good deal. They learned in this way more Chinook language than most adults ever could. I myself remember in the early 30s their arrival each fall in their buggies, long pigtails, and bony horses to set up teepees along the river somewhere. But by then they didn't mix very much with the whites. Thus, Rick writes, my father Chan began life in rustic, almost primitive conditions. But it was a high-spirited time, and ours was a high-spirited family. We pretty much lose track of Chan's adolescent years. He graduated from the 8th grade in the Methow and had no additional formal schooling. He was drafted in World War I and spent a while in France, but the war ended before he saw any combat. After Chan's return from the Army, he worked in the Northwest, mostly in the wheat harvest around Spokane and the Palouse. He belonged to the Odd Fellows Lodge, as did Arnetta Ziegler's father. That is how Chan and Arnetta met, courted for a year, and were married. Right at Ziegler's farm was a ford across the Little Spokane River. For a few months, Chan was employed in building a bridge there. Then they took jobs at a large wheat ranch at Cannell, Washington for the rest of the season. That fall, Chan wanted to go to Winthrop, where his father still lived. They took a punishing ride by bus on primitive roads and stayed the first night at the Winthrop Hotel, the same one that still serves Winthrop. I add, it's Carlos' 1800 restaurant there. Now, Arnetta's writing picks up the tale. We stayed overnight at the Winthrop Hotel until morning. Then we bundled ourselves as best we could against the cold and walked the 2 miles down to Chan's folks' house, where his mother welcomed me with open arms. She was a dear and kind person, and I loved her very much. I always liked Dick Mclean, too. He was a jovial, carefree old fellow. Well, Chan and I stayed there at Dick and Sarah Mclean's house until we could arrange to get a homestead about 3 miles southeast of Winthrop in the upland above Davis Lake. Indeed, it was a homestead, especially the tar paper shanty. Tar paper, 1 by 12 boards on end, then a layer of tar paper, then 2x4s battened over the cracks to hold the tar paper down and the wind out. It was lined on the inside with gray felt building paper. Better than newspaper, huh? We got settled and didn't have too much trouble keeping warm. People named the Hines were living near, so we had company. We stayed on the homestead several years and got a few head of cows to milk, so we had a weekly cream check to buy food. Chan worked for some farmers in the valley. We got on okay. And Ron was born in 1925. For the next 4 years, Chan found work on the farms and fighting fires for the Forest Service, and we got by okay. Rick started school in the fall of 1929. Chan had got a job at Carlton to pack apples, but a November cold snap froze all the fruit. So, we packed our belongings and moved into an old house near Gig Harbor by Tacoma, while Chan worked a couple months on the Hood Canal diversion tunnel for a hydroelectric development. Rick went to a little country school there. Chan's Uncle Ben lived in Sedro-Woolley and was able to get him a job building some railroad on the Skagit. We found a house there. And now Rick writes again. When Dad was occasionally home from work on the Hood Canal diversion tunnel, they would talk and talk about going to the Matanuska Valley in Alaska. It was being opened to homesteading. The excitement of this prospect dominated our lives for quite a while. Alaska. Alaska, it was so far and so mysterious and so very cold and dark nearly round the clock in winters blazing with northern lights. And cabbages got as big as wash tubs. Well, it required $200 and a very specific plan had to be followed, each homestead exactly like the others. My parents couldn't get $200. The plan evaporated, and that's probably a good thing. Early in my second grade year in Sedro-Woolley, Rick writes, talc dust dominated our life. Dad's Uncle Ben was working a talc. We sometimes we call it soapstone now, so think of soapstone if that's what you call it. Anyway, Uncle Ben was working a talc quarry up the Skagit. Its marbled green translucency made a fascinating and popular product. My great-uncle Ben was, I recall, very excited about the talc pancake griddles they made. They weighed about 7 pounds and were the size of a world atlas. They were quite brittle and easily broken until they had been heated a few dozen times. Then they became durable. They took a long time to heat, but the pancakes were then an extraordinary smooth brown, and the griddles were quite in demand for a while. Now Arnetta is speaking. In the spring of 1931, we realized we had to get settled down so the boys could go to school in one place. In the spring of 1930, the same week that Florence was born, Chan's father, Dick Mclean, had died of a heart attack. He had regained the property north of Winthrop, which he had homesteaded as a young man, the property where Ron's family now live. We asked Chan's brothers and sisters what kind of an arrangement we could make to buy the place. They said if we would take over a small federal land bank loan, we could have the deed. That pleased us a lot, as we both loved the Methow, especially Chan. It was home to him. So we took over the place and planted fruit trees, a garden, etc., as fast as we could get the money. We needed a cow pretty bad, and my brother, Bill, had 2 thoroughbred Jersey heifers due to calve in early summer. He let us have one cheap because they were bred too young. My other brother, Ernest, had a wood truck, so the heifer got a ride back to the valley with us from Spokane. Now Rick writes, I remember that day pretty much as follows. Uncle Bill's brother ran a woodlot and had a good-sized utility truck. In mid-April 1931, we loaded it with our minimal possessions. In the very early following morning, we added Brownie. That's the name of the cow who was famous in the family because she was tiny and ultra-productive, 3 gallons of milk daily. Yeah. Anyway, added Brownie, fashioned nests among the cargo for Ronnie, myself, and my 1-year-old sister Florence. We set out on the 200 miles to Winthrop. The trip that takes about 3.5 hours now was then a punishing 16 hours over poor roads, much of it unimproved. Just at dusk, we stopped partway up the quarter-mile grade to open the south gate and take possession of the 100 harsh acres and a rudimentary dwelling. The steep and broken sagebrush ridge stood to our left in the brooding twilight, resplendent Venus gleaming above the horizon. To the right, a quarter-acre of unprepared garden sloped to a brushy, dry creek bed. This, through the Depression years, was the focus of unrelenting husbandry and gardening. So ended the 2-year odyssey in which I had been in 6 different schools, from Gig Harbor to Skillicombe to Cedar-Woolley and a couple places in Spokane. All this from starting the first grade in Winthrop to come full circle, resuming there in the spring of my 2nd grade. Those next 13 years on the place were exceedingly taxing and busy. The perpetual moving about for work, always wondering if there would be work, had been a crushing affliction to Dad and Mom. Then, when the Depression hit in 1929, it had increased the concern about our very survival. To be able to reclaim his place in the valley after living a migratory, insecure existence in a sort of exile was very heaven to Dad. The workload was brutal, especially in summer and especially for Mom, but they didn't mind physical exhaustion. In the valley, they could plan. They could dream of a permanent place for the kids to grow up, get friends, get a regular school education, and maybe, most important, Dad could feel that he was again among peers living as most others in the valley lived. Barring some great calamity, they knew we could survive. It required little. Most food could be coaxed out of the garden and the cows. One way or another, the cabin could be patched up, wood could be gathered, and clothes of some kind could be got. Mom had a treadle sewing machine. She would revise old overcoats into caps and mittens, which were really very warm. Part of Dad's summer earnings would be allocated to winter clothing ordered from Sears Roebuck or Montgomery Ward. The order came by mail to the bottom of the hill, several large cardboard boxes. There were school supplies, sometimes bedding, corduroy trousers or denim jeans, replacement garden hose or a kerosene lamp. The variety was endless, and the excitement often eclipsed that of the austere Christmases. They did soon get horses and an old wagon for summer and a bobsled for winter, but neither Dad nor Mom ever did own or drive a car. Your turn, Diana.
A short blip from my diaries. One evening we drove through Elbow Coulee to Winthrop and went to visit Elma, Cynthia Bailey, Gladys Waymeyer, and Ruth Davis, who were playing pinochle in Elma's kitchen. Elma is Cynthia's daughter. Ruth related the fact that from the time she was born in Winthrop in 1898 till she was married 17 years later, she had gone to TWISP twice. Cynthia mentioned when she first came here, she was so poor, it was 7 years before she even left the valley to go to a circus in Wenatchee. One day I decided to find Eric Carlson, an elderly man, to ask if I could do his story for the paper. I finally knocked on the right door, heard an indistinct voice perhaps telling me to come in, so I went in and saw this man I'd never seen before. I asked him if I could do his story for the paper, and he said, no, his story wasn't interesting. And sure enough, the outline he told me didn't seem all that riveting. He did say, however, He'd been in the valley 67 years because he'd missed the stagecoach out. Okay, I'm going to read you from my book, a compilation of my journalistic pieces here, The Whole Damn Valley. And I've picked five of the people who I think represent different parts of the valley, and you will see. The first one is going to be about Mazama. Ellis Peters. Ellis Peters' crowning years aren't turning out exactly the way he imagined. The other day he said, "Whenever I thought about being retired, I always pictured myself as having years and years of nothing to do but enjoy myself. But she got sick, and now I'm left all alone." A couple of years ago, he and Martha moved into the Twisp Garden Apartments, leaving their Mazama home, the one with the graceful curve to its doors, with its front door eaves, the one they'd lived and loved in for half a century. Last summer, Martha died. The overwarm apartment is quiet. Once in a while, Ellis will turn on the TV to fill in the blank spaces. "My mind's up there in Mazama most of the time," he admitted. "But it's nothing like it used to be. Now, it's full of people. But I do get a kick out of thinking of the way it was. Up there, you could step out the door and see a bear or some deer, maybe even a cougar. One morning, I got up to close our bedroom window and saw the paw prints of a cougar on the windowsill." Ellis's vision of Mazama is made up of a million events and feelings accrued over the 70 years he lived there. He still sees himself a young boy running beside the rivers and befriending Indians who camped and hunted near his folks' homestead. Ellis often shared their food. "They had good eats," he commented. "Things like hot biscuits and potatoes and gravy. One time," I don't know if I told you this story before or not, it's sort of dirty. "Well, one day I saw them eating these dry brown things about the size of a silver dollar. So I popped one in my mouth. It had a taste all its own, something like raisins. After I'd eaten a few, a squaw laughed and pointed to a piss ant hill. They'd lured the ants into a honey jar and pressed them all together." Guess I didn't eat with them much more after that. Images of how the Indians caught salmon still play across his mind. One man would ride into the upriver side of a big flat pool, where he'd raise his deer horn spear and wait stone still. Then a few others would have waded into the pool's lower end and begun tossing stones, scaring the fish against the current and into the lethal shadow of the man on horseback. "I never saw him miss," Ellis said. Possibly there's no one else alive who remembers how the smell of camas roots, dug at Hart's Pass by the Indians and stored at the Mazama post office, would linger in that building nearly all winter. "It smelled good and strong, but kind of pleasant," Ellis recalled. Then the time came the Indians didn't come back so much. For some reason, they didn't seem to need the smoked fish and dried berries and roots anymore. They had cars, he said. A few years ago, the Aspen Skiing Corporation bought Peter's property. He was told by the company that his home stood near the spot they'd envisioned for a ski lift terminus. From the day in 1912 he first leapt from his parents' wagon onto Mazama soil until the sad hour he reluctantly drove away in 1984, Ellis learned countless things about Indians and animals and sawmills and loneliness and himself, about necessity and the feel of wild places. His observations span the time the land turned from hunting grounds to playground, from being the end of the road to being the beginning of a cross-state highway. Almost every day, he goes to Mazama, the best way, by memory. Looking into the emptiness between his sofa and the apartment wall, he said to himself, "But I heard it. Twisp will never be home." And then this is one on Perry Clark, written for the Methow Valley News in 1976. The Methow River swirled around the horse's legs. Perry Clark, age 11, sat as still as he could behind the Indian. His feet were tied together under the horse's belly. Holding his breath, he and the Indian watched the undulating forms of the salmon in the refracted light beneath the river's surface. The Indian held a spear poised. Like lightning, the Indian struck. The spear danced, but he pinned the salmon under the water until it perished. That was the way it was done. It was 1901. There were far more Indians than whites here during the summers at that time, Perry recalled 75 years later. One summer when Indians had come to the Methow Valley to catch and dry fish for the winter, Perry counted 32 teepees on Lake Creek. Us boys took a liking to those people, Perry said. We'd go fishing with them, even though my father didn't like them very much. They took care of us. That's why they tied my feet under the horse, so I wouldn't fall into the river if the horse bolted. I fished with Methow George once. He was a quiet old feller. He didn't do too much talking. And I got acquainted with Chillowas Jim. I learned to speak their language, Chinook, and sometimes I still speak it with Bill Robler just for fun. And later I will read you Bill Robler's story. Ross Filer, the cattle come first. On the door to Ross Filer's house is this handwritten message. To who this may concern, the cattle come first. I belong to the cattle ever after. Find me wherever you can, Ross. This is Ross's story, just as he told it to me. All of these is quotes. In 1900, my parents, Ben and Ida Filer, came to this valley. They had a wagon and a buggy, and my dad drove the cattle ahead of them. They just grazed them along, slowly just grazed them along. The grass was so thick, it was all headed out like wheat, and there was water in every nook. They drove the cattle right through the streets of Wenatchee. That first year, my dad put his cattle up Poor Man Creek. All he had to do was just let them out. Oh, and you had to brand them. Everything had to be branded, the cattle, the horses, everything, because some people are honest and some people aren't. Well, anyway, the thing was, cattle was the only source of income they had, and of course, you needed horses. They were just as plentiful as cars today. Horses, all they did was work. I was born in Twisp in 1903. I was the only sheep, and I was a black one. I was born on the 13th, and that's bad. I can remember when Twisp had one store. It was a great big store, groceries on one side, hardware on the other. Oh, it had everything. It had a great big round stove in the middle. I always wanted a stove like that. Just put a big chunk of wood in and let it burn all day long. And then there were two blacksmith shops. They were both going all day long. They were shoeing horses all the time. I was just a little bitty tyke, but I can remember. You know, a little boy is like a tree. He's got to get roots, but it's also very easy to get hurt. And then there was a harness shop, shoe shop. They had spurs and shaps and spurs and ropes. I used to watch them unloading freight. T.G. Johnson had the transfer business. Those freight wagons had 6 or 8 horses. I like to see a horse pull just as steady as clockwork. I remember March in 1918. I was sitting in a bobsled. The snow was deep, oh Lord. There was a stock sale going on in town. There was a horse there, a trained cow horse. I just wanted that horse so bad. Well, my dad started to bid on him, and I thought he was going to lose it. Well, he got it and put me on it. Boy, oh boy, I thought I was somebody. That was when I started driving. My father was a driver also, and he taught me everything I know. A man by the name of George Grant used to come up to the valley and buy up old hamburger cows. They looked like the dickens, and we'd drive them down the valley. Men were scarce then, it was during the war, so they got me to drive. Oh, heck, I had a big time. They told me, now you watch those cows, they'll sneak off on you. They were sometimes hard to keep track of. It was 4 days round trip to Pateros. I got $10.50 to make that trip. Well, we got down to Pateros with all those cattle. There was an old bridge there. That old thing would just sway and sway when you went across. When we got them to the stockyard, we loaded them up in the cattle cars. We put hundreds of head of cattle up on the range, sometimes as many as 300 head. Beatty put up 200 head. Jim Johnson, 36. The Watsons, 45 head. Joe Bonning, 97. We camped up there on the range all summer. We had Canyon Creek, the Middle and West Forks, and we had Lime Creek and North Creek and War Creek, and we had the Twist River. I drove for a lot of guys, and I stacked hay. Father said I was the best man on the stack. I overheard him say that. I did just what he told me to. When he was dying of cancer, he gave me instructions. He told me to pay off the men. I did exactly what he told me. He died in 1938. I took over the place. I still had my mother. We held on to the cattle and raised hay. I did everything with horses. I never did own a tractor. I had a 4-horse spring tooth. Even now, if you gave me a field and some horses, I could do it right. But with a tractor, I'd get ridges. We kept our cattle until 1945. By then, the Forest Service made it hard on range cattle. Mother died in 1949. Well, that just about brings you up to date. Riding herd, driving those cattle, doing that was my pleasure. That was my heaven. You got hot, and you got cold, and you worked hard, but it was still the easiest work in the world. It's when you can't hold your own end up that it hurts like hell. Sheila's coming back.
All right. Rick is going to talk to us again. He named this chapter My Other World. Dad took great delight in showing us things, from flowers to a hummingbird's nest, from a circle around the moon to a beaver dam, from building a campfire to sharpening an axe. With limited means and opportunity, he designed anything he could for our instruction, entertainment, or adventure, and, above all, trips to the mountains. The summer of my 9th year was the first such excursion for me. Ever since those magical 2 weeks, the wilderness has been my passion. Dad was assigned with one companion to build a switchback trail up the steep slope of the mountain from Bridge Creek to Stiletto Peak Fire Lookout, a rise of 3,000 feet. We went to meet Dad at Bridge Creek. He was there already with the horses packed with the provisions he had come down for. Up a steep bank and onto the trail was a strange and wonderful world. It was hot and dusty, but ahead lay a stunning sight. Left of the valley was a gray stone mountain, unimaginably big to my astonished eyes. There were only a few scrawny trees hanging to it. Dad was aglow with delight at my excitement. At Twist Pass, I saw the first view of real snow peaks in ranks toward the Cascade Crest. A cool breeze swept up Bridge Creek. Below us lay Dagger Lake in its green cradle set with large spruce. Big languid trout drifted along the shallow meanders. Lupin, asters, paintbrush, valerian, and a luxuriant green hellebore twice my height lined the damp, sometimes muddy trail. I asked Dad if I could go ahead while they spent some time adjusting pack saddles. He said okay. So I exuberantly hurried down the well-graded trail into ever more luxuriant vegetation, rotten logs and brooding fir and spruce. Suddenly, as the trail curved to the right around a tree, I froze with fright. A monstrous porcupine strutted slowly along the trail, with his quills thrusting menacingly in my direction. I'd never seen anything like this before, and I withdrew quickly in the direction of the pack string to the refuge of my father's presence. It was only one additional mile to Dad's trail camp. We arrived near dark. It was in a grove of large spruce sufficiently scattered for luxuriant shrubs beneath. They had cleared away undergrowth to the bare earth about the area of a small house. Attached to a fallen spruce was a hand-hewn wood table, over this a rain tarp. Dad's companion already had a blaze in the stone fire ring, hot coffee on the grate, welcome in the cold mountain evening. Supper was bully beef, potatoes, jello, baking powder biscuits, canned peaches, and coffee. Fearful that limbs might fall on our beds at night, we slept across Bridge Creek in a treeless huckleberry patch. We used a coffee can with a bale put along the side and placed a candle in it to light the way on two small logs across the rushing water. This was a bug, or as more colorfully described by Aunt Ruth, a bitch lamp. And so to bed and to sleep in a small tent on aromatic fir boughs, the rush of the creek not 20 feet away. That day was beyond any estimate of passing time. It had been a magic carpet tour of the universe. Your turn.
Two more wonderful people I got to meet and interview and be friends with. This is Bill Robler. He announced rodeos and called square dances. And this was written in the Methow Valley News in 1977. Hiya, folks. Glad to see you this year. Hope we got enough entertainment to keep you occupied. If not, we'll have to put on something extra, like me getting bucked off this here cream-colored horse. First, a few announcements. First rider out of the bareback chute is Foss Creveling. He's a good rider, and he can jump off and land on his feet when his ride is done. Next rider out of the saddle chute is Ole Scott, an old grave digger. He's a hard ride, seldom been ridden. This is Bill Robler's special quality. He doesn't merely remember incidents, he lives them for you. He goes through all the experiences again, relives the tastes and the smells of the past. When he quotes early day pioneers of the area, he puts on their foreign accents, since many of the settlers were immigrants from Europe. His impeccable ear allowed him to pick up the Chinook jargon fluently, and when he's telling his countless stories of the Indians whom he knew well, half the story will be in guttural, click-like language of the Indians. Luckily, he'll translate it for me afterwards. Bill began announcing for rodeos in Mansfield, Washington in 1917 for C.B. Susan's Wild West Show. Bill Roebler and his white horse Buckles became familiar figures in the rodeos around Brewster, Twisp, Winthrop, Chelan, Wapato Point, and Montz in the Big Bend country. With his strong voice and outgoing personality, he would ride around the arenas announcing the rides, making comments, keeping the crowd entertained and informed. With his Angora hair chaps and beaded gloves, he would ride tall in the saddle, put his mouth to the megaphone, and tell the crowds what they wanted to hear. When public address systems took over, Bill announced a few rodeos from the booth, but part of the show was lost when they unsaddled Bill Roebler and put him behind a microphone. Early rodeo grounds were located at several places in Twisp. One was located where the Twisp Airport is now, one at the elementary school's athletic field, and one where the Shell station now stands. It's not what a Shell, there's no Shell. Anyway, that was 77. This last field didn't have any corrals, so the bronc riding might rampage in any direction. Bill Roebler was in charge of the Indian camps that were set up beside the rodeo grounds. He would tell Indians where they could put their teepees and tents, get them slab wood from the sawmill for their fires. The county made Bill a deputy sheriff and gave him a star, which Bill says really impressed the Indians. They would kid him saying, "Oh, now you heap big policeman." One time, one of the Indian teepees burned down and Bill took up a collection from the rodeo goers. He collected $75 for the Indian. In the early 1920s, a man named Virgil Vance took first place in the Okanagan Rodeo. Bill asked him if he wanted to take a ride in an airplane to celebrate. He said, sure, and he slung his saddle over his shoulder and strode down to the field where the plane was waiting. Virgil threw his saddle over the tail section of the airplane and mounted up. The plane took off. Bill says, I got worried then. I thought for sure the pilot would have tied Virgil onto the plane somehow, but no. When the plane finally landed, a shaken Virgil Vance slid off. That's the most damn leather I've ever pulled in my life, was all he said. Bill is called for dances all over the country. When he first started out, he was living in Pearl, which was about 12 miles east of Bridgeport. He had moved there with his grandparents, the Barcelos, in 1909. They had come by train from Wichita, Kansas, where he was born in 1898. While he was growing up in Pearl, dancing was the main form of entertainment. He called dances in Leahy, Pearl, Carlton, and at Grange halls, and at the scores of house parties during the winter times. At the house parties, if you didn't feel like dancing, there were tables for pinochle, and there was always a potluck dinner. When they were at our house, he said, we'd always cook up a bunch of chickens. Dancing was such an obsession with Bill that he and his friends would go to any length to get to a dance. He remembers once rowing across the Columbia River, fighting off drifting ice of the cold winter to get there. They rode to the other side, which was the Indian reservation, and they walked to the Morris schoolhouse. That night, as they were dancing, a severe blizzard blew in and raged all night. Well, they danced until 5 in the morning while the wind and snow howled outside, and then Mrs. Morris cooked everyone a huge breakfast of hot cakes, eggs, and coffee, and the boys helped cut the firewood and milk the cows, and then they all went back to the school, danced all day and all night, and were finally able to row back across the river. They had outdanced the blizzard. Bill relates hundreds of stories about his experiences with the Indians. They come one after another, with him reliving each tale and rattling off Chinook as if it were his own language. Bill was once talking to two Indians. "Felix," he says, "I've heard you people are good at predicting how the winter's going to be. What's it going to be like this winter?" Felix said, "Oh, it's going to be a hard one, very hard." The other Indian said, "No, it's going to be an easy winter." And Bill scratches his head and says, "Well, what is this? One of you says it's going to be hard, and the other says it's not." Felix answers, "Oh, I got hay to sell, and he got none." Bill's memories of the past are so vivid, they cause the present to dim. Any room he's in begins to fade, and all of a sudden you find yourself at an early day rodeo in the sunshine or at a house party stomping your feet. If words were pictures, Bill Roebler would own 100 galleries. I have to, one more wonderful person, Ole Scott. He was a packer. If nothing else in the story rings true, this does. They don't make them like Ole Scott anymore. To be with him in the mountains is to be with him in his natural element. To see him riding tall on a half-broke saddle horse, leading a string of pack mules over the steep Cascade Pass, is to see him at home. He has this to say about his life. "I used to think I'd like to have lived 100 years ago when the West was just opening up, when it was really wild. But when I get thinking about it, I realize I've seen the best of it the way I'd like to live. When I first started coming into this back country, not many people had been here, only a few sheep herders. I'll tell you one thing, I'm damn glad I won't be living 100 years from now." Over his lifetime, Ole has ranched, been a fool, rodeo, bronc rider, and a mountain packer every season since 1934. He has also been many things to many people. Tom Graves, fellow packer, expressed it this way: "Every kid has his own hero. Well, Ole has been my hero ever since I was a boy. He knew how to fight, pack, and ride the best of anyone else I knew. Riding broncs at the rodeo, they just couldn't buck him off." His daughter, Faye Brown, now Faye Graves, went on, "He's the kindest, most sensitive man when it comes to animals and children. I think the reason kids take to him is because he's always himself. He never pretends to be anything other than who he is. I think he's a wonderful man, but of course I'm prejudiced." Last week, the Scotts took their family, a few friends, and me on an 8-day pack trip to Surprise Lake. As the men loaded the mules at the trailhead, one half-packed beast started bucking through its load and jumped off into the trees. Ole just roared with laughter. The dust settled and still there was laughter. Somebody eventually went into the woods to find the mule. Said Faye, "When you've got an excited horse, you don't need an excited person. Dad used to take us camping when we were children. He was just so patient with us, and I know we were devils. The trails were bad and dangerous then, but he would just laugh like he does now." That night, after setting up camp, Ole sat at the campfire and asked, "And what if we had gotten up at 4 a.m. and rush, 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 hurry, hurry, hurry? What for? I'm here now and plumb relaxed. This is living. Used to be when I'd get up in the morning before sunrise, I'd fish, 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 fish. Now I like watching the kids fish and just ding around, maybe take a snort of the old barley corn." As we broke camp the next morning, Ole led the string of 5 pack mules. The trail dust rose and blended with the smell of leather and horses. The wild-flowered meadows spread around us, and the fir trees combed us with their shadows. Ole pulled up in a meadow of lupin. Those behind me might have wondered what I was stopping for, he said later. But it was just such a pretty spot, I just had to stop and take a look around. He's been in these hills forever, and still he sees the beauty and talks to wild animals. You always learn something every trip, he added. That night, after the dishes had been scraped and washed, everyone settled around the fire. Ole laid back on the ground, hands behind his head, his boots glowing in the firelight. By gum, he smiled, this makes a guy feel like he'd like to live. You know, I love every minute of a campfire. But I must say I've probably walked 1,000,000 miles around them in my day, avoiding the smoke. The days in the hills passed with an almost impermissible serenity. We lacked for nothing. For months, Ole's wife, Letha, had prepared for this trip, making lists of food and gear. She had remembered it all, from thread and needle to chainsaw, from camp bacon to darts for the kids, from a camera to hobbles, from hoof nippers to Alka-Seltzer. On the last night by Surprise Lake, Ole took his place by the fire, leaned back, and looked up past the fir branches to the startling array of stars. He said quietly, I can't think of anywhere else I could have lived where I could have enjoyed life more. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to close us out with a couple poem songs from my dad. My father, Ron, became a teacher, poet, and folk singer. His love of the mountains was expressed in poetry and song and great hikes. Dad always reached for the truth. Truth formed the walls and the roof of the philosophical cabin he worked on for our family and the community. His writings, poetry and songs, were the reaching for the beauty in his truth. What I'm going to read to you was written for singing, but I can't sing worth beans, so I'm just going to read it to you. The dry cheat sings in the summer wind. The blue haze stretches far over the foothills, dry and bare, onto the uplands, blue and fair. I ask no sweeter cup to share than these, my own dry hills. A cricket sings on the hill tonight, a full moon's rising fair. Peekaboo clouds are drifting by the face of the moon in the purple sky. A song of peace is the nighthawk's cry, for these are my dry hills. Up from the riverland damp and cool, the air still drifts in the early morn, bearing the scent of the aspens tall, the song of the chewok's gentle fall. No sweeter song, no gentler call than these, my own dry hills. The mold that cast that which I am are these, my own dry hills. In ways I am a mountain tall, in other ways an anthill small. Granite, shale, dust and all, I am like my dry hills. And I'll end this reading with one of my personal favorites, a song that expresses to me the awareness and love of nature that underpin my family's pioneer cabin philosophies. It happened in a meadow green in the mountains, white and tall, that I heard the wind crying in the fir trees, dwarfed and small. As I heard the distant rumble of a frothy waterfall, I heard this gentle message from the mountains, white and tall. There's a moment out of keeping with the grief and pain we know when the puzzle fits together and the world seems to flow in a rhythm, smooth and perfect towards some purpose, though obscure, that's aligned with all creation, and it's definite and pure. When the white peaks piercing skyward touch the blue sky bending down, many streams of icy water from the meadows pouring down sing a love song to the flowers, waving softly in the wind. and I hear this gentle message speak to me and say again. There's a moment out of keeping with the grief and pain we know when the puzzle fits together, and the world seems to flow in a rhythm smooth and perfect towards some purpose, though obscure, that's aligned with all creation, and it's definite and pure. Thank you.
You've been listening to Voices of the Methow, an off-the-wall production. Until next time, thanks for listening.